Cristobal, thanks so much for joining me on the Mark Divine Show.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm stoked to have you here. Nice to meet you, by the way, sir.
Thank you very much. Likewise.
So, I'm excited to have this conversation. What I'd really like to start with, Joe, is kind of like a little bit of your origin story. Like, where are you from, and what were the early influences, parents or peers, or just your own insights that kind of set some major trajectory for you in your life?
Yeah. Well, I was born and raised in Tampa, Florida. And
okay.
Yeah. And Tampa, I still think of Tampa as my homeland. But at the age of 15, I left Tampa to go to a boarding school up in the Northeast. And I had never seen snow before.
Your parents wanted to get you out of town, huh?
Well, I think, honestly, my mother had aspirations for all her children, all four children. So I had an older brother who had preceded me to the same boarding school. But you asked about those early influences, and I attribute so much value to my grandmother, my mother's mother in particular.
Mm-hmm.
She was a widow who lived in a small house not too far from our home. And I just loved her. I mean, she's a quiet kind of lady, but I loved to visit her. There were four children in the family, and I think maybe she kind of favored me a little bit. Maybe I'm romanticizing that, but we certainly got along well, and I just loved her, and she was a wonderful influence on my life. Sadly, she passed away when I was 11, and for many, many years after that, in my late teens, my 20s, when I hit a really low spot in life or some terrible obstacle or great disappointment, I found myself thinking of her, even calling on her name. She was just a wonderful influence in my life. Yeah.
And that's really sweet. I mean, that's quite possible that she was there for you, right?
Yeah.
In all those years.
I think so. Yes.
Yeah.
And so Tampa formed
cool.
me.
So
I was born in the 1950s, so that clues you into on the era in which I grew up. The 60s, of course, was a time of great tumult in the country, and I was up in the Northeast, and that marked a whole new chapter in my life.
Right. I read that you were really interested in literature at a young age. So what was it that kind of got you interested in English literature? Did you have a voracious appetite for reading, or what was it that kind of led you there?
Sure. Yeah, it was the stories, the stories in these classics in particular. And in the fourth grade, I think it was the fourth grade, it could have been the third grade, I was kind of a sickly child, and I had to be home a lot, not in school. And in those days, we had many fewer diversions and distractions, as you are aware. And so reading was that was my escape. But it was the stories. I remember, and also I must say the comic book version of some of these classics that I read in the first and second grade. Like I remember in particular The Count of Monte Cristo, which is just a rousing adventure tale, right? And had me completely engrossed. As I got older, I realized, this is a novel. It's not just a comic book. And so I really began reading the novels, and I was fortunate to go to a private school, a parochial school there in Tampa, St. John's Parish Day School, and the headmaster, who was a Canadian, was very, very strict, and very demanding. And he had us reading, the one I remember in particular is The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, when I was 9 years old, 10 years old. Not an abridged version or a dumbed down version, but the original. So I give him credit, for that influence as well.
That's pretty powerful. I think I was reading the Hardy Boys at that age.
I was reading the Hardy
And you're
Boys
reading
too.
classic text.
Yeah, no, I love the Hardy
That's great.
Boys. Yes. So, but it was
Me
always
too.
seemed to be centered around story. That just, and then
Yeah.
as I grew up, I kind of tried my own hand at writing stories, and eventually that led into filmmaking.
Hmm. So you went to Harvard undergrad with this idea of getting into lit, and you decided along the way that you wanted to kind of shift toward the arts and filmmaking. So was that a hard decision? I mean, seems like all the work to get into Harvard, it'd be hard to bounce from there to my alma mater, which is NYU also. My
Oh,
graduate
okay,
school.
cool. Well, I think you asked me, was it a hard decision? It was
Yeah.
actually more a stupid choice that I made because I could have finished
Okay.
at Harvard. I entered as a sophomore, so I'd already knocked out the first year. But I lacked, not to shift blame to anybody because there's really nobody I would name, but I did lack direction, I think, and I was rash, in making that decision. It wasn't really necessary. I could have stayed at Harvard, and
Hmm.
it was just another 2 years. But what's that saying? Youth is wasted on the young. I don't know. I just didn't have the maturity to see deeply enough that, hey, look, finish your degree here at Harvard and then study film at a postgraduate level. That just didn't occur to me.
Right.
So I was very intemperate and wanted to move ahead. So yeah, that I do regret that decision.
Yeah. Well, sometimes, those are powerful because we learn from them. Maybe there was some other point in your life where you said, you know what, I need to just finish what I started here.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That's we if no life experience should ever be wasted because the
No.
failures in life, quote unquote, are great teaching experiences. And so yes.
So, where was it that you really started to find your passion, your groove, as a screenwriter and, producer
Yeah.
or director? I don't know. Do you do both, production
I
and
do
direction?
both. I'm known as a writer-director.
You do both,
Yeah.
writer, director.
Well,
Okay.
funny enough, it did sort of spark at Harvard. That year I was there, there was a group on campus, and I couldn't tell you the name of them at this point, but they would show the classics of cinema. They had like film retrospective, they would call it. You see a flyer on the bulletin board, and I said, that looks interesting. And I remember going to, I believe it was Adam's house there in the yard there, Harvard, and they had this beautiful library with, as I recall, the bookshelves went way up high and these nice, big, comfortable chairs, and somebody had set up a 16 millimeter projector. We're talking 1972, 1972, 71 even could have been. So there was, I don't think there was no VCR in any event, but they had gotten a hold of 16 millimeter prints, and I remember watching several Russian classics, Italian classics, French films, Swedish, a lot of foreign films, and I was kind of transfixed by it all. I had never seen movies like that in my whole life, and I was deeply impressed. In the year prior to going to Harvard, I had taken a year off after high school. I spent that year in Australia, which also influenced me because I was 10 months in Australia thinking that I would become a photojournalist because I loved to write. I was good at writing, and I got interested in photography as well. So I just thought, well, that's a career choice, photojournalism. But filmmaking came in like a wave and just kind of swept me away. I just became so enamored with it all. And then I thought, well, where can I go to film school? So,
Mm-hmm.
and that's how I ended up eventually at NYU, which was a great
Seems
school.
to me, even though that whole industry was still in its early stages, wasn't it? I mean, how big was the writing Hollywood kind of film production industry in the late 60s and early 70s? I mean,
Yeah,
compared
there
to
was
today, it was just a speck.
Yeah, the indie filmmaking scene was was at a very early stage at that point, for the United States, with exceptions, of course. But you had Francis Ford Coppola as one, Terrence Malick, another, George Lucas, and several others. They had tended to go through the USC Film School. Martin Scorsese, he went to NYU, or he taught at NYU. So they were definitely there in place. But you're right, it was early on, and I mean, by no means had I figured it all out, not at all. But at NYU, I did think, okay, this can be the how do you say, the stepping stone to bigger and better things. My college advisor there was Haig Manoogian, who was Martin Scorsese's advisor. So I thought,
cool.
Well, I'm pretty close to this, and my screenwriting teacher was a man named Robert Allen Arthur, who has passed away, but he produced Cabaret back in the day. And he was a great screenwriter. He taught me how to write screenplays. So there were a lot of good things that happened to me at NYU.
That's amazing. So could you just kind of walk us through what it takes to write a screenplay? I mean, I've written a few books, and I know people listening, many have probably written books, but what's different between writing a book and a screenplay?
Sure. I think the first and most important thing to understand is that a book is tantamount to the final product. A screenplay is a step in the process to a final product. So if we compare it to making a film, if we compare making a film to building a house, let's say, the architectural blueprint is not the house, but it shows everybody interested what the house is going to look like. So while screenplays are not the final product, no movie ever, I mean, this is my opinion, but I think it's borne out by many people who would agree. No movie ever rises above the screenplay. Meaning, if you don't have a good screenplay, you're probably not going to have a good film. And if you do have a good screenplay, you might have all kinds of resistance and problems and whatnot. But if you hold fast, hold true to the plan, the design, it's a design. The screenplay is a design. If you hold fast to that, chances are you're going to have a nice film when it's all said and done.
So
there's an art to writing a screenplay, but it's writing a book is a different animal.
So does a screenplay have a formulaic arc to it, like the hero's journey, or are there more than one arcs that a screenplay can have?
Well, you mentioned that, and that's I'm a kind of a contrarian, I suppose, but I do resist the notion that you have to follow these rules. I mean, they're there. You can buy a book on how to write a screenplay, and they'll give you rules. But I don't think they. Well, it's a little. There's that saying. When you really have experience, you can bend the rules or break the rules.
Right.
But as you're learning, you need to follow the rules. To learn.
Right.
So,
that makes
but
sense.
I would, I've always sort of maintained that if your film is just a formulaic creation, you're going to have a kind of formulaic film.
Right. You see that with all the blockbusters that they're trying to produce today. It's just the same, literally the same story with different characters.
Yes, exactly.
Over and over.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's just like, it's almost like crack. It's just exciting for the short hit, and everyone moves on and forgets it a moment later. Mm-hmm. I can see that. Breaking the rules is adding an element, it adds that element of surprise. It's like the third body problem, right? You have something expected, and then all of a sudden, breaking the rules is bringing something completely unexpected into the story. That's cool. So, what's your, like, how would you characterize your style, or like your genre? Do you have a style or genre?
A film or writing?
I don't know what you call it.
A film or
either, both.
Well, I do gravitate toward drama. I'm an indie filmmaker at heart. I mean, I would like to be, bankrolled by Hollywood. Well, maybe I wouldn't want to be bankrolled by Hollywood, because then they would
controlled by Hollywood.
Yeah,
right? Be careful what you ask for.
Yeah, that's right. But I'm drawn to drama. My track record shows that I've often taken true stories and dramatized them. I have to say, I've kind of, over the years, just kind of fallen into that more than set out to do that from the beginning. But there is great power, I believe, in working from a true story. And of course, we've all seen those movies that have the little clip at the end of the real the real life characters, and that's kind of an area that I like to work in. But I also enjoy, for lack of a better word, I'll just say surrealism, like Federico Fellini, some of his movies. He's an Italian director. He's been dead many years now. Or Ingmar Bergman and some of his films. Because I think film is, it's certainly an art form, and it's a newer art form. And I think we're constantly learning how to use it to express ourselves. Like the Impressionist painters did, in the late 1800s in Europe. They were met with great hostility at the beginning. And now we look at their paintings and, that's not the case anymore. So I do long to experiment as well, but within a story. Again, going back to what you had asked me earlier, I was talking about how I've always been drawn to the story.
So, what is the most challenging movie that you've produced, where maybe you just thought it wasn't going to work out and then it did somehow?
That I've actually made, or that I have written and want to make?
Well, I guess you could tell either. I'm just more interested in like the struggle, because it's easy to think that it's all, gravy when you have these some big successes, but there's nonstop struggle along the way.
Yeah, no, you're right. Well, I could point to my very first movie, which I made in Mexico on a shoestring budget. It was ridiculously low budget, kind of like I think Robert Rodriguez made The Mariachi Man for $25,000. I was in that category. Right? That was a struggle. Excuse me. From every vantage point, but we got it finished. I think the movie that fits that description well is, I can think of two. One is Final Solution, which I made in South Africa, and we filmed in the year 2000. And I had been working on the screenplay and some fundraising for that film going back to 1988.
Holy cow.
12 years.
What was the film about? Just refresh my memory. I remember seeing it. But...
Yeah, based on a true story of an Afrikaner, a white South African who was essentially a white supremacist, and he was a bit of a thug, frankly, but he was a very intelligent guy and very charismatic and had his following. Eventually he became an attorney, but early on he was more a thug who would beat up people. You know, he and his friends would go into the townships. This would have been in the 1960s, setting houses on fire, beating up people. I mean, he didn't probably tell me everything he did, but he was not a good guy in those years. And then he had a wonderful transformation, a spiritual transformation, where he became a Christian, and he repented of. Oh, I meant to tell you earlier, he actually had formulated, this is where the title of the movie comes from. When he was that thuggish white supremacist, he had mapped out a plan that he called his final solution for the blacks of South Africa, which was essentially to round the black people up into the townships where they already were in the main, and essentially liquidate. It was a genocidal plan that met with some acceptance on the part of the military establishment in South Africa. Now, this was in the 1960s that this was happening. He never did it, but that just shows you the kind of person he was. And he had this transformation.
How did he find Christianity? What was the turning point for him?
Yeah. Well, one thing was his wife, who in fact was the daughter of a military man himself, but not of that ilk, you know, who didn't believe in anything like that. And also from a book called Cry, The Beloved Country by Alan Paton, which is a wonderful book. I would highly recommend you, if you haven't read it, or anybody listening. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. It's been made into a movie several times. Once with James Earl Jones, another time with Sidney Poitier, called Cry, The Beloved Country. And he read this book, which he considered propaganda and lies, but his girlfriend, who became his wife, said, read it. You think you know everything. Read that. They met at the university. Read it and see if your ideas actually hold up in the marketplace of ideas. And he begrudgingly, because he liked her, he said, okay, I'll read it. And he was overcome by the book, which, you know, to me, this is so important because his heart, I really think all along, was a tender heart. But for whatever reason, he had just become so filled with hatred. But this book served as the lancet, you know, to puncture that awful casing around his heart to bring out the beauty of him. And that really had a book, a single book.
That's amazing, the power of words.
Yes,
you know,
it totally,
all this spiritual energy. That's so
yes,
cool.
it reoriented him, and he and then he, I can't remember now, but he met some Christian people here and there as well. But it was that book that primarily got him on that path. And then in our movie, we see how he reaches out to a black man, a young black man that he at one time had beaten up, you know, within an inch of his life. And he realizes what he had done. And so he asks forgiveness, you know. Your question had to do with, you know, difficulty. And it took me 12 years to shoot the film. And then it took a few years to edit the film. And then the distributor, I think, basically stole from us financially.
Oh, no.
And so a lot of horror stories. But you can still watch that film on Amazon if you want to. Just put in Final Solution. There may be other films as well, but our movie would come up under my name. Yeah, and then most recently, my most recent film called Let Me Have My Son has been very, very challenging, very difficult. I've never had enough money to make the film. It's semi-autobiographical, so it tells the story of my oldest child who developed schizophrenia as a teenager. And it was a severe case. He has had to be institutionalized for many years. He's doing better now and soon to be discharged, so we're very thankful for that. But I wanted to make a movie that would celebrate his life. And you know, I think that when we share a story like this and show, I mean, in my case, I show, well, this is my story, and this kind of gives you an idea of how we have walked this very difficult walk as a family, that it can encourage other people. So,
right.
And I've seen that. I've seen it. We've only released the film. It's only been out for 3 months, but we've been getting feedback, good feedback from mostly good
Imagine.
feedback.
I mean, mental health, you know, is kind of like the elephant in the room in the Western world. You know, I think it's just far greater than anyone's willing to admit. You know, and a large part of the homeless population is really mental health issues.
That's right.
And it got exacerbated and magnified because of COVID and the isolation and the fear. So I think it's amazing, and probably the transformation that you had to go through to write this story, and, you know, in honor of not just your son but the whole family system that was trying to support him back to health. That's powerful. People need to hear that, especially since there's so much negativity in the world, you know?
Yeah.
So thank you for doing that. I want to come back to that, but you talked about a transformation of this South African guy by finding kind of Christianity. And I noted in your bio that you had a similar situation. Can we talk about that a bit?
Sure. Yeah, I did. I mentioned my grandmother to you at the outset, who was so dear to me. She was a Catholic woman, devout. My father's family were Protestant. But I knew as a child, my grandmother, I understood as a child without being told that she had a very special connection to God. I'll put it that way. And I don't think that ever really left me. And I remember when I was 12 years old, she had died when I was 11. And I knelt down in my house there in Tampa, and I said a prayer. And I said, God, let me help people. That was my prayer. I want to be someone who helps other people. And in my mid-20s, and I left out, and when I went off to the boarding school up north, and, you know, like from the age of 16 to 25 or so, I went to go live in New York City eventually. I became almost an anarchist, I could say, a nihilist, existentialist, agnostic. I mean, I don't think
pretty common for young, you know, college age kids in the 60s and 70s, right? You were in good company.
I was in good company. Well, all my friends were that way, so I guess so. Right. All my friends were similar. But you know, I was in my mid-20s, maybe 26, 27 perhaps, no older than 27 though, and living in New York, and I was in Manhattan at that point. And I was reading an article in the Village Voice newspaper talking about this Swami, a Hindu holy man, Swami Muktananda, if I remember his name correctly.
I'm familiar with him. Yeah.
And how he was in the Greenwich Square having kind of a rally there. And people, I didn't go, I was just reading about it. And I found, and how he would touch people with his peacock feather. He had a peacock feather, and he would crown you on the head with his peacock feather and give you his blessing, I suppose. And many people were touched in a positive way. And I'm sitting on the floor of my apartment in Manhattan there, and I just burst into tears. And that prayer I had made as a 12-year-old came flooding back into my soul and heart. My prayer was, God, let me help people. But I wasn't praying the prayer. I was crying out saying, why am I not helping people? I felt like I had not done anything, absolutely nothing in all that time to help anybody, really. I mean, maybe I was wrong, but that's how I felt, that I had not done anything to help people. And sort of along the same time of that experience, maybe the year before, I had been reading books about spirituality, religion. I was reading books about, I read the Bhagavad Gita, for example. I read books by Edgar Cayce dealing with metaphysics. I was studying Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, and in my own way, practicing meditation. I wasn't in a group, but just reading, trying to do it. I had this desire to know if there was something more than just the physical reality. I mean, I could touch my hand, I could, I had a body, but is that all there is? That was my big question. Are we just molecules? Are we just something physical, and that's it? And I just had to find an answer. I had to find an answer. And when I read that about the Swami there, it just got me looking deeper and deeper and deeper. And I made a trip to Australia where I was writing a screenplay. It turned out to be, it was based on a true story, and it turned out that the main character of the story I discovered, who, by the way, was a Ukrainian immigrant to Australia. It turned out in my research there in Australia that he had been a Christian. And that explained so much of his behavior, because he was like a holy man, which is why I was so drawn to him. But then I discovered that his holiness came from being a Christian. So I went out and bought a Bible, and I started to read the Bible. I thought, well, because I was told, in fact, that he had a Bible. Eyewitnesses. I spoke to people who had known this guy. Oh yeah, he had a Bible, and he would tell stories to us children. And so the drama of his story occurred in the 50s, 1950s. So I was there after the fact. I never got to meet him in person, but he inspired me to begin reading the Bible. And when I read the Sermon on the Mount in particular, I was absolutely transfixed. I was overcome almost, you could say, because again, I had been searching consciously for truth. And there was a big if. I mean, maybe there is no truth, That was a possibility, right? Maybe there's nothing here, But if truth could be found, I wanted to know it. And when I read the Sermon on the Mount, to me that was the answer. That was I found the truth. And that I marked that as the beginning. I can't say I became a Christian right then, but at that point I was 28 years old in Australia reading the Sermon on the Mount, and within a year I had become a born-again Christian. I went back to New York, started going to church.
What does that mean to you, born-again Christian?
Well, I'll be honest with you. At the time,
that phrase of being twice born, or an idea of an awakening experience where you suddenly awaken to, the greater totality of your existence. I mean, there's a lot of every tribe and every religion has a version of this. So, what does that mean to you, born again?
Yeah,
Christian?
I must tell you that I had never heard of the term myself until I was working at a health food store there in Manhattan after I had come back from Australia, and I carried around this pocket New Testament, and somebody said, "Are you born again?" to me. And I said, "What is that?" I didn't know what it meant. And of course, Jimmy Carter, the President Carter, he famously said that he had been born again. But I can tell you what it means to me. What it means to me now, and back then too, I learned that in the Gospel of John, chapter 3, Jesus says to Nicodemus, "You must be born again. You must be born again." And then Nicodemus said, "What do you mean? I can't go back in my mother's womb and be born again." And he says, "No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a spiritual rebirth." So for me, being born again means almost, you could say, having a second chance. I'd like to think of it that way, where you you kind of get, I won't say you get to live life over again, but you get to live what remains of your life from that time forward with a different set of eyes, with a different perspective, with a different orientation to everything, to life, to dreams, to by dreams I mean when you sleep and you have dreams, just to everything, people you know, places you go, nature, just everything is perceived differently. That's how I like to think of it.
Yeah, I like that's a good description. And also your relationship to your past, right? So you don't, you can have forgiveness toward yourself. And anyone else who might have hurt you or wronged you.
Well,
and that's
thank
powerful
you
to
for
release a lot of that energy.
Thank you for saying that, because I'll just be frank with you. Of late, I've been struggling with with that exact thing personally, where I'm still trying to get over some things that I've done in the past, But I'm reminded that the Apostle Paul, he had a troubled past, and he said, "But you know what? I'm not going to focus on that. I'm not going to live in that. I'm going to forget the things that are behind, and I'm going to press on toward the things that lie ahead." And forgetting what is behind, it doesn't mean that you just sort of like the monkey who says, no, he can't hear anything. He doesn't, not that. You know things happen that you may regret, or you did things that you may regret, but you're going to let them go. And like you say, forgive yourself. If God has forgiven you, who are you to hold on to unforgiveness, right?
That's right.
We need to forgive ourselves too.
My favorite quote that I often say to my folks is, "The ego is resistance to what is. And what is everythingness."
Yeah.
Right? God, source.
Yeah.
And we get
That's
to play
very
our little
interesting.
part, and our ego it wants to take responsibility for everything as if it were master of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And then when things don't quite go according to plan, we beat the shit out of ourselves.
Yeah.
That's not fair.
No. No.
Give ourselves a break. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So I want to come back. The title, it's so powerful. "Let Me Have My Son." It sounds like a cry for help to Jesus or to God.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. You're right. A cry that is literal, true to life, in the sense that when Daniel, his name is Daniel, when he was first institutionalized at the age of 18, after 5 years, I was watching my son, who was a great athlete, by the way, this beautiful young man, and he had so much potential, and here he was locked up in a mental hospital, and they're giving him all this medication.
Can I just ask, was there any kind of triggering thing? Because I had a friend whose son went schizophrenic, and it happened after one incident with drugs, just triggered something. Mm-hmm. Was there anything like that with your son?
Yes.
Triggered it?
Yes. And it's a host of factors here, probably, because he did experiment with drugs. That's one. There is a history of mental illness on both sides of the family. His mother's side, my side. So I've been told by psychiatrists he likely has a genetic predisposition that the drug
that got
use
switched on. Yeah.
Triggered. Yep. And there was some trauma in the home. Trauma is never a good thing, and can often lead to a flashpoint with mental illness. Yeah. But when he was in the hospital, they were giving him different kinds of medication, and nothing was really. They were kind of stymied. They didn't really quite know what to do, and I could tell. In fact, one of the doctors told me he'll likely be here the rest of his life. I couldn't accept that on any level, but that's when I began just saying, let me have my son, because I felt that if I could get him at home, and probably wishful thinking, I'll admit, but if I could have him at home, he'll do better, And
right.
I became his legal guardian, and I forced the hospital's hand. I said, you have to give me my son, let me have my son, because we're moving to Mexico. And I had lived in Mexico before and spoke the language, and my other kids were on board with it. I was going through a divorce at the time, so it was sort of me and my kids. And we went to Mexico, and I got my son. Let me have my son. They gave me my son. And we depict that in the movie, what happened in Mexico. And it was not, it did not answer all the problems, if you will, but on the positive side, I will always be thankful for Mexico, because that time we had there as a family overall was absolutely beautiful. And I had my son at home, and he did get better. But that's not the end of the story. He also had a relapse. But for a time he did better.
Was your son, when it comes to like spiritual healing, do you, how much of his recovery do you think was just like your energy, bringing just the energy of love or God, that what you would consider to be spiritual energy, and was he attuned to that, or
yes?
What's your perspective on that?
No, that's a great question, and he is attuned to that, very much so. And in the power of love, we hear that said, bandied about. It's real. I know it's real.
Yes.
I've seen it in operation with my son in particular. And he is very, very open to spirituality, to Christianity, to love. We will often, he's about to get out of the hospital, but right now he's at a distance, so I don't see him that frequently. Maybe once every 2 weeks I make a trip to go see him. But whenever we talk on the phone, which is almost daily, we often pray together, and he will pray for me. And when I was making the film, I'd pray for him, and he'd say, let me pray for you, Dad. Let me pray for the movie. And he would pray that the movie would have a profound impact on people's lives. Just beautiful prayers. And my son is very, very attuned to other people, and he loves people. He really genuinely loves people. He's interested in them, and he wants to be connected to them, which is why it's so painful when he's separated by an institution from other people, even his own family.
Right.
So we're really looking forward. I'm looking forward to seeing him kind of bloom in the the coming years. I have a lot of friends who are just waiting to visit him. He'll be in a group home, so it'll be a totally different situation where people can come and go and meet him, and spend time
What
with
does
him.
recovery look like, Cristobal? I mean, what does recovery look like for him?
For him, if we're just frank, he'll never, he's 40 years old now. He's not going to be the professional athlete that I thought he might have been at one point. He's diminished. There's no question. He's diminished. The medications, there are side effects to these medications. His hands will quiver. He depending on when you're talking to him and when he's taking medication, his speech may be slurred. But recovery is him feeling loved, experiencing love from others, and then giving love. And when and maybe that sounds highfalutin, but I mean in the real world kind of thing.
That's awesome.
That's what recovery looks like. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, we've got to wrap up here. So the movie is out. The book, did you write the book first? Was that like the screenplay?
Yeah, well, I wrote the book first. The book is not a novel, however, just so that you understand. It's more a collection of letters that were written over the years, asking people to pray for my son and telling the story along the way. But it was written before the movie, yes. And the movie is streaming on on Amazon Prime.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can go to our website, letmehavemyson.com, that has all the information about how to watch the film too.
Nice. So what's next for you, Cristobal?
Wow. Well, I have 4 grandchildren nearby, and I just visited 2 others out in New Jersey. I have remarried. My wife is a lovely person and a great support to me. So I don't know. I'd love to have some good family time for several months here. But I do want to make more films. I'm getting up there in years, and I'm not an ex-Navy SEAL. So, I'm not but I'm in pretty good shape in terms of, I'm not limping around. I have ink in the well here, I think there's more I can do.
Yeah, you sure do. Ink in the well. I love it.
Yeah.
And you can replenish that ink supply anytime. That's awesome.
I hope so. So I would like to make more
thank
films.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I look forward. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate it. And best to your son.
Thank you.
Honestly, we send him our love.
Thank you.